Scary stories to tell in the dark. They're these horror anthology novels slash books that you'd probably see if you were born in the early 90s, the early 2000s. They're really popular because of a lot of reasons, but like on the most superficial level, they're really popular because of the illustrations, and there's a reason for that. They're really great. They definitely were a lot more, say, abstract than you would see in like your average like kids horror story at the time, and definitely like the content of the stories themselves were a lot more, they were like more harder horror than you would see than from like a Goosebumps or something you would see like on Nickelodeon or like the Disney Channel. And so they had kind of a profoundly, say, profane element to them. They were kind of talked about as being these things that only like brave kids would want to write or read. And that was kind of the appeal. But like the things that people like to gloss over is that the stories themselves were really interesting too. They're a lot more, let's say, older, more disturbing and kind of abstract than the average horror story. And they're also kind of stories that like were urban legends that people would talk about all the time. Like think like the Hook story with like the serial killer. And I think that is in one of the books. I'm sure that like the story of the girl with like the boil on her cheek that turns into spiders, I think that's like pretty like, I think that has like a lot of different versions. But in these books, they kind of more difficult to read than the average horror story that a kid at that age would be introduced to or allowed to see. And I think that's what made them particularly memorable. I think that also there was like a lot of like really odd illustrations that like were really interesting. Like there was this one where this is like there's this horse figure and it's like wearing like a stiletto shoe. It's really weird. And then there's like one where like this kid is being dragged by like a rocking chair by like a like tentacle monster in the sky, and there's like this like wraith like coming through and like on like the upper end of the image, and there's also like planets in the background, like super abstract stuff like that. And that's what I think is really interesting. So obviously this is like a property that's like generally known in the zeitgeist, gets passed towards a movie, and now here we are. And the things I like about the movie, I think that it uses the iconography from like a superficial visual standpoint in a very interesting way. They go for practical effects, and you don't really see that super often, and I think that is something that is very Artur-esque, and it's something you don't really see a whole lot. You know, like a lot of people like to talk about practical effects as if like they're inherently better than CGI effects. I don't necessarily agree with that, but in this movie some of the images are pretty interesting, and they definitely come straight from the original source material. But ultimately what the movie ends up being is kind of a mediocre kids solve horror mystery story by way of like Stranger Things or It. And it sounds like a really, I don't know, like obvious comparison, but the movie is so devoid of any like artistic or like creative merit other than like the fact that it takes the iconography from these really I would even say like iconic images, and then uses them for like kind of a lame soft horror vehicle. That sucks. And I think it sucks too because it doesn't even end on being just that. It also has like a lot of really odd like racial politic in the movie. Nixon gets mentioned a lot, and a way that they go for making one of the characters really relatable is by double downing on like the racist ideologies of the people in the town. It works and it doesn't. I don't know if it's really a bad thing, but since the movie isn't really in service of doing that, it just feels exploitative. I totally like through this whole thing forgot that like I'm going like straight into spoilers, but I haven't like really described what the plot is. So it's like, say a plot is like that fucking Goosebumps movie that came out like a while ago. I think it was like a year ago. It's like, hey, this is the book, and then you take the book, and oh man, you released all the monsters from it. It's that. And so this movie is really bad, and it's really frustrating because I feel like it only broadly uses the iconography of the original stories in a really superficial sense in order to like push this really mediocre, like by way of Stranger Things in the new It movie. And I just don't really like it very much. It's really frustrating. The kid acting is really bad, which is something that happens all the time, and you can't really like call a movie out for doing that, but it's really, really bad in this movie. Like, for example, there's specific, it's like, so I think this is even trickled down to people who like aren't super privy to like tropes in movies and just in like books and media in general, which is that like it's pretty like widely groaned upon trope to do the you don't verb the noun verbs you. And they do it in the movie, and it's really, really jarring because it's such a bad line, and the take they get from the girl who says it is really so bad. And it really just makes me wonder, who on the editing table didn't see that and wanted to take it out. It's really jarring. And there's like another one too, like later on in like the climax of the movie when the main character's trying to stop the villain from attaching this horrible fate on their friends, she like bursts into a haunted house and screams like, "You gotta stop telling these goddamn stories!" And it really has like a very like Snakes on a Plane type beat, and it's really, really funny. And it sucks because like, if anything, I laughed in the movie way more than I really ought to have, and it felt really awkward because like I was laughing so much that I felt like I was even like emboldening the people around me to not take the movie seriously anymore too. And that was a really odd feeling, because like, yeah, well, let's be honest, like I'm probably not in the focus group that this movie was made to attract. But at the same time, it's PG-13. And actually, like, one thing that the movie does do in service of the original stories, which I do think is commendable, is that they hit some pretty good jump scares. And I think, like, exacting, like a lot of people, they really don't like jump scares, or they think, like, jump scares are, like, indicative of like lazy filmmaking, and I do agree to a point, but I do think that like the movie equivalent of like telling your friend to grab someone at the climax of a spooky story is kind of like the mechanical equivalent of a jump scare, and they got some pretty good ones in this movie, a lot harder than you would see in an average PG-13 flick kind of like this. And I do commend them for that. And 2 out of the 3 designs that they lift from the books, they look really good in the practical effects that they use to portray them, I gotta say. I didn't really like how they portrayed the pale lady. I don't remember what the story is called, but everybody knows the image. It's really disturbing, and it's really actually kind of meaningful to me because I remember when I was a little kid, that was one of the first images I saw in like a book that like truly disturbed me. And like I remember like having the book on my desk during like elementary school lecture. I wasn't paying attention on it. And so like I would sit there and hold my thumb on the page, look at it, and be like, oh, and then close it. And it was like, oh man, I don't know what that feeling is, but I kind of like it. It's kind of morbid and profane. And it kind of sucks too because the story is really good as well. And it's something that's really frustrating, is something that they broadly miss in the movie, is that like a lot of these stories didn't end with someone like dying. And if they did, it was because like the story was like a parable, and like the main character like was exacted upon a draconic fate for like a critical character flaw. And so like a lot of the time in these stories, these characters would just like something horrific or morbid or unexplainable would happen, and they would just have to deal with it. And that's how the story would end. And that's exactly how the Pale Lady story ends in the book, which is that the lady goes in her dream to a room, and the Pale Lady's there, and she's like, "Don't come here anymore. Blah, 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 it's evil." I don't remember specifics. But then she goes apartment hunting or something, goes to the same room, she's there, she says the same thing, and then she leaves, and the horror comes from the fact that she now has to live with that reality, that something truly paranormal happened to her, and now she just has to live her life on. And the Pale Lady didn't attack her, Pale Lady didn't like murder her or like send her to the Shadow Realm or some shit like that. She just, something horrible happened to her and she had to deal with it. And I feel like people want to like believe that kids can't understand these kind of like existential, even almost kind of Lovecraftian horror elements, but like I certainly did. And I really personally enjoyed those books because that's what they were, that's how they were unique. And it really sucks to see a movie distill just from a really superficial sense why these images are so iconic, because I think it has a lot to do with the context and the text of the original stories, which they completely miss because they distill these images into the schlock monsters. The Pale Lady like kills her target by like mommying this kid to death, like sucking him into her belly, and it's just really odd. It really just begs the question. It's like, you know, you always had those kids that would have the books but would like not have the attention span or the desire to like read any of the stories. They would just flip past this like the images, and I'd always be like, those kids are fucking plebs. But like now it seems like those kids were the people that ended up going and fucking making these generic movies, and that kind of sucks. Also, is something that like I personally was really felt like was a little awkward about the way that the movie was portrayed is that it is a period piece, and there's all of these awkwardly put together politic in this movie. Like every single scene there's like a TV that has Nixon talking on it, and then like someone says something about how they don't like Nixon, and then like one of the major plot developments, like character developments of one of the kid characters is that he's a draft dodger and like he doesn't want to go to the military, and it almost seems like the movie wants to put the audience on his side because everybody in the story who seems like righteous or good like has something bad to say about Nixon, but then like the people who are considered evil and bad and cruel, they are also racists, and they do like kind of feed into that negative politic. And it really is just like, what did they mean by this? Like the character who ends up meeting the awful fate of the Herald story with the Scarecrow, he's just like an evil racist kid. He's not just like a jerk. And like the movie really doubles down on this obsession with anti-might is right politics. It is really awkward in this in this movie. So like ultimately the things that I liked about the movie was that it kind of felt like they were trying to shoot it well. And that sounds like a backhanded compliment because it's like it is pretty in most parts, and you know there's a reason why shooting stories in like these weird like Rust Belt Gothic towns in October looks aesthetically pleasing. There's like a bunch of orange. There's like nice grays, movie looks good. But then there's like, especially in like the monster attack scenes, there's these really disorienting shots where it feels like the movie was gonna be like in 3D, and then they just decided not to. Like one of the kills, like one of the kids like vomits into the camera, but like the whole shot is so dark and it's like so jarring from one thing to another that you're just like, what is even happening? Also, there's a scene where like they call him the Jangling Man, who's like also like this like read in anxiety that the evil spirit is exacting on the Draft Dodger character, because like his brother came home from the Vietnam War in pieces, so the Jangling Man is like metaphor for his guilt. But like anyways, like she throws some guy's body at like the prison cell doors, and it's like this, they like did the shot from the ground and it's like being hurled over it, and I'm thinking like, what is even happening? And it is really fucking awkward, because it's like definitely for like 90% of the movie looks perfectly competently shot, and then there's these weird scenes where it's like, ugh, what the fuck? Like, they have an editor? But like, anyways, so you have those things, and you have like this whole legacy of this book series that like is only really important to like 10 15 years, like the millennials. So like this movie, even though it's PG-13 and people are saying it's for kids, it's like really not for kids. It's for people who remember the original stories. And also, I think it's really weird that people are saying like this is a great entry for children to get into horror and all this. What the movie is PG-13. Like a good way for kids to get into horror is like Ghostbusters and Ghostbusters 2, more so Ghostbusters 2, but then also like Gremlins. This movie is just really bad, and it's really like insipid and dumb, and that means it's a kid's movie? No, it's just a dumb, simplistic, mediocre movie. I don't understand. The whole movie that like is subtextually fucking gibberish, because nothing really amounts to anything. Also, there's like some kind of like implication that there's going to be like more stories at the end, because like instead of the way that these movies usually work, which is that like when the kid like meets their demons that were specifically made for them because the book like read into their soul, like once they like lose to the monster that's supposed to fetch them, they get like transported to like this shadow realm, which is implied to be like this weird like voodoo mysticism that like one of the servant girls like told the abused child, and that's why she has evil magic powers. There's some weird stuff going on there, but like ultimately like there's like 3 different things going on. Like there's the subplot about like Nixon being elected, there's the plot about like stories becoming like their own monster over generations, and then there's like the subplot about the main like the villain becoming abused and then becoming abuser when she's ultimately like meets a horrible fate, and the main characters have to like guilt trip her into making her feel bad because she's like really killing all these. You gotta stop telling these goddamn stories. Anyways, I had a horrible time. It was like a 4. Hey, thanks for listening to my fucking video. If you liked it, follow me on Instagram, like, comment, and subscribe. Bye. Delete all of that. It was really uncomfortable. It was so awkward. I don't know if I want to do this anymore.
You just did this for almost 30 minutes and you want to delete everything?
Yes.
Jesus fucking Christ.